I called back in 2 or 3 minutes, spoke with his cousin, a guy, gave Devin my cell phone number and told Scott to call it 24 hours a day so that I could talk with him and talk through this matter and arrange his testimony for a time of his Patty talked to Devin this morning. Devin did deliver the message. He said that Scott came there last night to get a shower. That he was hanging out for a little bit. He gave my cell phone number. He delivered the exact message as soon as conveyed. Actually, Scott didn't say anything. He hasn't called me yet. We spoke with Devin this morning. Nobody's seen Scott. We had anticipated calling him this afternoon at 3:30 if we can find him. He is currently homeless. He floats around and takes showers at his aunt's house where Devin lives. And so we think, potentially he'll arrive there sometime in the next couple of days. And so at this point, I would ask you for a warrant for his arrest as a material witness in the matter. Given his failure to even discuss the matter with us, comply with any requests to be here, he has been served. He was served at his deposition last week where we sat down and took his deposition, stressed from the informants from both sides to testify honestly. I think he's a material witness to everybody in the room, and I would ask at this point to have an arrest warrant for Scott Searles so that our guys can pick him up and deliver him to court when they find him.
Counsel for Wayne Greenlaw wish to be heard on the matter?
No.
Counsel for Ray Greenlaw?
I have no position one way or another.
We'll issue a bench warrant.
I'm in the process of typing it down now.
All right, so we will issue that warrant, and once I sign it, clerk will hand it.
What do you need to do before we get it to Mr. Wells? I just need a copy of it.
I'll get it broken.
Can I show you the vitals on information?
Yeah, and just for the court's record, if he's located today, we'll bring him here today. If it's over the weekend, we'll bring him first thing Monday.
Is this?
We need a copy of something, please.
Okay, good.
The court reporter brought up an issue that we need to address. Probably doesn't come into play until this afternoon, if it does come into play this afternoon, but we have a couple of minutes. Procedure suggested by defense counsel works for everybody, doesn't really work for the court reporter. She doesn't know when to do cross-examination on the record and when to say direct examination.
Well, I spoke with her about it earlier, and what I told her is in the scheme of things, I'm going to be getting up there to do cross. He's going to do direct. So I told her that how I would do it was just style it cross/direct, because it's going to cover both.
Well, and it doesn't matter for my purposes. I'm not usually the one, well, that's not true. Certainly, I'm not usually the one looking at the record. There are several proceedings I look at the record. But there are issues that arise either on appeal or post-conviction motions that specifically say this should have been done on cross. Well, that's not going to be clearly evident from the record.
Well, we discussed that, and what both of us have agreed is no matter whose witness it is, that we will both treat it as cross and as direct. We can plead witnesses. You're not going to hear any objections to that because of the nature of it. Now, when it's a witness that is not our witness or a witness that's not his witness, then we revert back to the old rules, except that we're going to still call together. So, but I'll say, for instance, the gun specialist from Michigan that I call him he's our witness, and so Mr. Will examination.
So you need to announce for each witness whether they're a joint witness, a state witness, or a defense witness.
I think that's the best way to handle it.
If it's a joint witness, call it examination. If it's a state witness, direct, cross. If it's defense witness, direct, cross. I guess that's the best and clearest way.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. We've agreed to have relaxed rules throughout, and I think that's the same as
We do have to, we have to identify which one is the joint witness.
Right.
Joint witness for state, Wayne, and Ray, or just state and Wayne, or just state and Ray. Yes, absolutely. So we'll need that before each witness.
Okay.
So she knows how to record the respective counsel's examination.
you have to stamp and, the copies? No, they get the original, I have a copy.
Okay, so then we need to get that to them so we can start on that before we get back up. Deputy Murchison, you want to take roll, make sure we have everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
So you can bring them into the jury room. We may not be quite ready.
Yes, ma'am.
You want to use joint witness or state witness? I don't care.
Yeah, I guess so.
Judges, talk to everybody, I think we've agreed, Justin Riley, Dave Reese, Amy Seward, Allison Murphy, for all state witnesses, everybody else in the state makes some calls. For both defendants.
And then, Judge, there are some people that are not on Mr. Will's list. For instance, I don't know how he wants to treat Mary Cassell, who we eventually will audit. That will actually, you know, I don't see why we would do it different. We're gonna call Mary Cassell, and I'm assuming she can be.
That's fine.
Stephen Howard, who is the defense witness, is our expert. Potentially, Robin Riley, but potentially Natalie Adams, but
Jury.
Is there anything else, counsel? That we need to address before we bring in the jury?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Will? Can we bring the jury in or do
Yes,
you need
ma'am.
some more time?
Give me about 30 seconds.
Get them lined up.
He'll be at his aunt's house taking showers at some point.
seated. Everyone else may be seated. As to defendant Wayne Greenlaw, does council wish to make an opening statement at this time?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, you may do so.
Good morning, folks. My name is Steve Lawrence, and I represent Wayne Greenlaw. And I'm going to move this out just a little bit so that I can see everybody.
Twist that front left leg, Steve.
All right, let's try that again. I'm Steve Lawrence, and I'll try not to fumble the exhibit. First of all, this is opening statement. And as the judge told you before, you should not consider anything that the lawyers say in the opening statement to be facts about this case, not evidence. But an opening statement is designed to tell you the particular person's side or story about an event. And Wayne Greenlaw is going to tell you a completely different version of this. And I'm going to walk you through it. On the morning, on the afternoon of the 28th day of October, 2011, going on almost 3.5 years ago, a young man by the name of Scott Searles came over to the Greenlaw house around 6 p.m. that afternoon. He had become, over the last year, a good friend of Wayne Greenlaw. You're going to hear that over the course of this trial that Wayne Greenlaw, my client, had moved into this neighborhood 3 or 4 years ago, and he had moved in there by himself. And in a month or two just immediately preceding these events, his brother, Wayne Greenlaw, had moved in there, as had his mother, an elderly lady by the name of Sherry Denlow, who's in her 80s. Sometime in the preceding year, just as fate would have it, Wayne Greenlaw met Scott Searles. Now, this is a very small little neighborhood, and this is Aston Drive, this is Azalea, and this is Roosevelt. If you went up slightly past this row of houses, up to the next row of houses, the evidence would tell you the name of that street is General Doolittle. And at number 9, General Doolittle, you would find that to be the residence of a gentleman by the name of James Porn. Wouldn't want the name, but it is what it is. At that residence, at that time, was a whole herd of people, and you're going to hear about them, but specifically living there was Mr. James Porn, who was the stepfather of Scott Searles. Scott Searles and his then girlfriend, Kendra Walls, were living there. They had 2 children that were living there. Mr. Porn's wife, or significant other, I'm not sure which one it is, was living there. And in addition to that, Scott's brother and sister-in-law were living there with their child. Now, this home is not particularly big, so it was a cramped situation, I'm sure. But in any event, during the preceding months, sometime around a year prior to the beginning of these events, Wayne Greenlaw met Scott Searles, and they become friends. Now, Scott Searles is a much younger man than Wayne Greenlaw. You'll hear from statements that Mr. Greenlaw was in his 50s, and I believe at the time Scott Searles was around 21 years of age, young. You're going to hear that during the course of this that to say that he has a terrible drinking problem would be a misstatement. Literally, you're going to hear testimony that says that he would drink as much as 36 beers a day. And you're going to hear testimony in this case that on this particular day, he drank in excess of 50 beers and shots of whiskey. So, on the afternoon of the 28th of October, 2011, Mr. Searles journeys from his house up the street, you can't quite see it, at number 9 General Doolittle on his bicycle, and he rides down to Mr. Wayne Greenlaw's house, which is at number 9 Aspen Street. When he arrives there, Wayne Greenlaw and Ray Greenlaw and Scott Searles drive up to Publix. Mr. Greenlaw purchases some food, and then they all go to the liquor store. They come back, and Mr. Searles, sometime between 6 and 7, the exact time is not known, and you're going to, once you hear all these people testify, you're going to understand why. Mr. Searles returned, went back over to number 9 General Doolittle to speak with his significant other, Kendra Walls, and told her that he was going to go back over to Greenlaw's house, which he did. He returned there sometime around 7 p.m. that evening, and Kendra Walls did not accompany him because their 2 children were asleep. Well, it's right, the 2 kids were up, but the persons who were going to babysit the kids, one of the family members were asleep, and Kendra couldn't come over until someone had waken up to be able to take care of the 2 children. That eventually occurred sometime between 9 and 10 p.m. You're going to hear testimony to both. I don't know. So it will be what it is, but somewhere in that period of time she went over Greenlaw. Mr. Greenlaw, in the couple of days preceding this event, had been trimming some trees and bushes in his yard and had cut those trees and bushes into pieces that could be burned at a fire. And they were having a bonfire in the backyard, and Mr. Greenlaw was sitting out in his backyard drinking beer, and it was at or about that time that Mr. Searles comes up to his house sometime around 7 o'clock after they had previously split. And they sit and they had several beers out by the campfire and our bonfire, fire pit. You're going to see some photographs of it. Sometime around between 9 and 10 o'clock that night, Kendra Walls comes over. The caretakers for the children that night had awakened, and she walked from her house at number 9 General Doolittle over to number 9 Aspen Street because, like her significant other, Scott Searles, she had become very close friends with Mr. Greenlaw, Wayne Greenlaw, over the course of the last year. So they're all sitting around out back, occasionally feeding the fire, and more occasionally feeding themselves with alcohol. But sometime between 10 o'clock and 11, I think the testimony will be, Mr. Searles asked Kendra Walls to marry him. Pretty romantic. Sitting around the backyard of the house, at a bonfire, drinking beer. But that's what you're going to hear. And upon hearing that, Mr. Greenlaw, who was the owner of a white Jeep, and the white Jeep will become significant during the course of this, allows Fincher Walls and Scott Searles to take his Jeep over to an area known as Dry Lake. And you won't see it on this photograph, but it sits right over here, not very far from this subdivision, and in fact is exactly what it sounds like, an old dry lake bed. And we're gonna have some aerial photographs that will show you the dry lake bed and its relative proximity to this particular area. So, any event, Ms. Walls drives the Jeep with Mr. Searles in the Jeep, because when Ms. Walls got there that evening, she had not been drinking. On the other hand, her significant other had been drinking ever since he got off of work that evening, somewhere around 4 o'clock, had already consumed quite a number of alcoholic beverages. So she drove out to this area to try it. Exactly when they left and exactly how long they were there, I have absolutely no idea. And I've been doing this case for 3.5 years. But you're going to hear the testimony from them about what it is, and you'll form your own opinions about it. But in any event, sometime during the course of that night, while they are at Dry Lake, people go out there, and I think Mr. Will explained it to you earlier, they go out there to, apparently there's sand dunes and stuff out there. They go out there to four-wheel, sit around and make bonfire, campfires, and sit around drinking beer. Or other alcoholic beverages, as the case may be. And that's what they did. And I think the evidence would suggest that they got there sometime between 11:30 and 12 o'clock. You need to listen to it and see if you can figure it out, but general parameters. At some point in time, while they were at Dry Lake that night, they met two gentlemen that they'd never met before. Both of those gentlemen are the persons that are the victims, alleged victims in this case. One of them is a gentleman by the name of Brian Leverett, and his friend was with him, a gentleman by the name of Justin Riley. Mr. Leverett drove a black Ford F-150. You're going to see photographs of it. And Mr. Leverett and Mr. Riley, like Mr. Searles and Ms. Walls, had also come out to Dry Lake for exactly the same purpose. They too previously had been drinking, and they too were coming out there to consume more. And they all did. Exactly how much they consumed, you'll have to ask them. They give varying accounts of that over the course of time. But I think it would be safe to say that they drank a lot. And they drank a mixture of alcohol and pure whiskey and other ones and beer. So at some point in time during the course of that night, the two of them, who are not too far from each other, they somehow meet. There is a discrepancy if you, in the testimony. You're going to hear it. One side says that the other ones walked over to them, the other side says the other ones walked over to them. Who knows? But they did get together, and they continued to drink alcoholic beverage while they were out there. At some point in time, Ms. Walls is going to tell you that Justin Riley asked her and Mr. Searles if they wanted to buy some pills. And I think specifically the one that she mentioned was Lortab. And she's going to tell you that Mr. Searles and she declined their offer. They didn't want any. However, they told him that they had a friend who might, because he had been hurting really bad because of his back. And that friend was Greenlaw. So sometime between midnight and around 3 a.m., there was a phone call made to Mr. Wayne Greenlaw's house from Scott Searle's phone. And that phone call basically consisted of asking Mr. Greenlaw if he wanted to buy any more text. And Ms. Walls is going to tell you that he did not. For whatever reason, the meeting, depending once again at who you ask and when you ask it. Because today, of course, we are in 2015. These events took place in October of 2011, and over the course of the last 3 years or so, the lawyers in this room have taken many statements of these persons, and the statements change from time to time, and it's really hard to put some sort of an idea exactly what took place. But in any event, at some point in time, the two of them parted. One other thing about that meeting out at Dry Lake was apparently Ms. Walls indicated that either Mr. Leverett or Mr. Riley had recognized Mr. Greenlaw's Jeep. He drove a white Jeep, and this is Mr. Greenlaw's house right here. Mr. Leverett's house is right here. And if you go back up Roosevelt, past General Doolittle, and we'll show some photographs later on about that, you're going to find Mr. Riley's home. And even though this is a small place, these people did not know each other, but apparently either one or both of Mr. Riley or Mr. Leverett had seen the Jeep and said that they recognized the Jeep. And during the course of this, they had a conversation, and the conversation essentially consisted of the fact that Ms. Walls and Mr. Searles had told Mr. Leverett and Mr. Riley that they had gotten engaged that afternoon or that evening, and that they were, when they left Dry Lake, they were going to go back over to Mr. Greenlaw's house, and they were going to have a party and continue to drink and sit out by the bonfire. And apparently, at some point in time, again, depending on when you ask and what the answer was, there's at least the possibility that Ms. Walls and or Mr. Searles had told Mr. Leverett and Mr. Riley that, why don't you come join us over at Mr. Greenlaw's house, but they don't know you, so don't go there until we get back. Eventually they part ways, and Mr. Searles and Ms. Walls stay out there for a while, and at some point in time, when, I honestly do not know, and I think when this case is over, you won't either, is sometime between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock, probably closer to 3 would be my guess, but it's based upon statements that persons have made and statements you're going to hear. Mr. Leverett and Mr. Riley drive from Dry Lake, and they go to the Greenlaw's house. Mr. Riley spoke to the police the morning of this event, and he told the police that, in fact, they being Mr. Brian Leverett, drove his truck, and as he, with a passenger, drove it over to and parked in front of Mr. Wayne Greenlaw's house, coming from Dry Lake, which is over here, and Roosevelt, the truck out in front of the house, pointed in the direction of ultimately where Mr. Leverett's house would be. There are varying accounts of what took place the first time that they were there, but there are at least 2 different versions. One of the versions that you're going to hear is that Mr. Greenlaw, my client, Mr. Wayne Greenlaw, was out back by the fire, tending his bonfire. He was going to try to burn all the brush and wood and stuff that he had cut the preceding day or two. And then his brother Ray was in the house. At some point in time, one version is Mr. Leverett and Mr. Riley came up and knocked on the door, that Mr. Ray Greenlaw came to the door and answered it, and basically it was, you know, who are you? And, but that they were let into the house. They went into the house. Eventually Mr. Wayne Greenlaw, my client, comes from the backyard into the house. And despite the awkwardness of a situation where it's 3 a.m. in the morning and the two people are coming into your house that you've never seen before, in this version, they come in and for a while they sit down at the table, and I know this will be shocking, but they drink alcohol. So they're all sitting around the table drinking and having a conversation, and at some point in time the conversation leads to Mr. Wayne Greenlaw's, my client's, gun collection. He kept his gun collection in a gun safe in his bedroom. Mr. Leverett was a hunter, and the two of them at some point in time apparently went back to the back bedroom, had a conversation about the guns that Mr. Wayne Greenlaw had, apparently including opening the gun safe and showing him the gun collection. But at some point in time, Mr. Leverett didn't think very highly of Mr. Greenlaw's gun collection. He's a hunter, a traditionalist, shotgun, handgun, basic rifle. Mr. Greenlaw had 2 rifles, I believe, one of them a Mini 14, some handguns. But in any event, he didn't think very highly of it. They got into a little bit of a dispute back there. Voices were raised. The other two, Mr. Riley and Mr. Ray Greenlaw, are sitting around the table. They can hear it. And at that point in time, they all go back out to the front, out to the kitchen. And at that point in time, my client, Mr. Wayne Greenlaw, asked them to leave. And in this version, they leave. My client locks the door, and they are gone from some time. There's another version of this that I think you heard a little bit from the state, which was essentially the same thing, except that whenever they left, Mr. Riley would say that they never really left, that they were attacked at the front door by Mr. Ray Greenlaw, and that a fight ensued, and then all the rest of this happened. There is another version of this, which was conferred by telephone call at 4:46 a.m. in the morning. And that was Mr. Wayne Greenlaw calling Scott Searles and Kendra Walls. And the substance of that phone call went essentially like this, that 2 guys that I don't know just barged in unannounced into my home. Kendra Walls and Scott Searles, fearing it was the 2 guys that they had met back there, at that point in time left Dry Lake in Mr. Greenlaw's truck and came back to their house. According to Ms. Walls, who seems to be the more reliable of the 2 given her state of sobriety, they get to the Greenlaw's house around 5 o'clock in the morning. That would be 5 a.m. And when they arrive, there, Mr. Riley and Mr. Leverett are not there. They come from Dry Lake the same way that Mr. Leverett and Mr. Riley had come. And they parked, instead of parking their vehicle in front of Aspen, headed back down toward the Leverett house. It in fact was Mr. Greenlaw's Jeep, so they pulled it into the driveway. They pull the Jeep into the driveway, and they get out, and they have a conversation in the front yard, and maybe even in the backyard. You're gonna have to figure it out. I haven't been able to, maybe both. But in any event, at some point in time, Ms. Wall says that they stay there for about 10 minutes or so, and that she gets a phone call from her brother-in-law, or whomever the caretaker of their children was, that says, you need to get home. So she asked Mr. Searles to take her back home. Now, I know this will probably be pretty surprising, but there's two different versions of how they got back home. Seems to be at least 2 or 3 versions of most everything. But I believe the evidence is going to show that in fact they being Mr. Searles and Ms. Walls, drove the white Jeep back from Aspen down to Roseville over to number 9 General Doolittle, where Scott Searles dropped Kendra off and returned to Wayne Greenlaw's house. However, at or about the time they were about to leave, they being Searles and Walls, Mr. Leverett and Mr. Riley reappeared. They had left. They'd been asked to leave. The door had been locked. Some time had passed. Walls and Searles had enough time to come from Aspen over to the house and spend almost 10 minutes or so at the Greenlaw house without either one of them being there. But they reappeared. But when they reappear in the front yard, everything appears to Ms. Walls to be okay. She does not see them fighting. She does not hear them arguing. They come into the front yard, and it appears to her that they were having a conversation. And I believe when you take all the time frames that you're going to see in the evidence in this case, you're going to conclude that that took place at or about 5:10 in the morning to 5:20, within a 10-minute period. And phone calls and other things wasn't there. So Mr. Searles and Ms. Walls leave, go back over to General Doolittle, and you're going to hear an investigator in this case tell you that he has driven that distance, and he can tell you how long it takes to go there and how long it takes to come back. And I expect that he's going to tell you that round trip, that it takes a little bit over 3 minutes of just driving time. It's not far. A minute and a half over, roughly a minute and a half back. Slightly more than 3 minutes. Now, no one knows exactly how long Ms. Walls and Mr. Searles were in the driveway saying goodnight. I don't know. A short period of time, though. But in any event, it seems that the evidence would tell you that when Mr. Searles left to take Ms. Walls back over to number 9 General Doolittle, that there was a passage of time of maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And that's going to put this somewhere around the time of 5:30 a.m. Mr. Searles drives his truck back. It's actually not his, it's Mr. Greenlaw's. He drives it back and he parks it in the front yard. And Mr. Searles his memory is terrible. He's given several that not too reliable, but bottom line is 2 other people saw it. So you're gonna be able to narrow down the time frame. And the bottom line is this, is that at or about 5:30 a.m. in that morning, now remember, Searles and Walls had left around 5:10 to 5:20, probably closer to 5:20, had driven over to the house. Mr. Searles gets back right around 5:30. That is going to be something that you will find out because two people saw it. Those two people would be two neighbors across the street. The one directly across the street was heard at 5:35, according to her testimony to the police on the morning of the event. Her name is Diane Housley, T-O-W-S-L-E-Y, Diane Housley. And that morning, she is awakened at or about 5:35 a.m. Now, she is an elderly lady, and she has a medical condition. And because of her medical condition, her house, which is just directly across the street from number 9 Aspen Street, she sleeps right up in there on a couch in the living room. And right over the top of that couch is a window. Now that window has some blinds on it. They're they're not like the vertical blinds in the courtroom. They're the blinds that are either plastic or little metal, tin kind of blinds that you can open and shut, and a lot of times if you put your finger into them, you put a little crack in them. That sort of blind. They're not particularly expensive or anything. But she hears the following at 5:35 a.m. She looks out her window and she sees the shorter of the two Greenlaw brothers, the one that she described that way, the shorter of the two brothers, the one with the gray hair, and she specifically says, I believe it's Ray Greenlaw. And the evidence in this case will show that Wayne Greenlaw is several inches taller than his brother. She sees him over at his house, and there are two men that she does not know or recognize, and they're standing in the area of the front porch of this house, and you're going to see a whole bunch of photographs of it. So you won't have to speculate on it. And Mr. Ray Greenlaw is telling them and says, and she's going to tell you, that on 4 separate occasions during this relatively short time period, he says that this is not your effing house, get out. This is not your effing house, get out. This is not your effing house, not your property, get out. 4 times. She saw it and she heard it. And she's going to tell you that the two men were mocking him. That's the word she used. They were mocking Mr. Greenlaw, and they were not heeding his warnings. You need to recall, of course, this isn't the first time these two gentlemen have been to this house. They were kicked out of this house earlier, and now at 5:30 a.m. This goes on for a period of a minute or two. And at 5:36 a.m., the neighbor right here calls 911. Her name is Nicole Robinson. Now, her husband, Eric Robinson, works in Sanford. Did then, I think he still does now. And he has to leave very early every morning. And at the time, she had a 4-month-old baby. And you're going to hear her tell you that she had woken up that morning sometime around 4 a.m. to breastfeed her baby or to feed her baby. And that her husband has to get up very early every morning. He leaves every morning between 5 and 5:20 every morning. Mr. Robinson is going to tell you the same thing. He's going to tell you, and we'll get back to the 5:36 phone call, he's going to tell you that he came out of the house that morning, right here, out the driveway, and he saw 4 people over here that morning at or about 5:15 to 5:20. Now, when he saw those 4 people that morning between 5:15 and 5:20 or so, they did not appear to be having any trouble. And that is consistent with the testimony of Kendra Walls, who said exactly the same thing. However, by 5:36 that morning, actually by 5:35, Diane Towsley has seen major problem going on. Nicole Anderson, her husband has now been gone for a few minutes, and at 5:36, she makes a call, and she is extremely upset. And the first thing out of her mouth is, I see 4 men fighting in the front yard across the street. Now, there was some real confusion in her. 911, of course, is trying to get to the heart of what's going on. Where is this? Well, when you come down Aston Street, you're going to find that the houses on this side of the street, they're numbered in even numbers, and the one on this side of the street are numbered in odd numbers. But you would think that 2 and 4 would sit across from each other, but they really don't. It's kind of weird, and that's exactly how she describes it to the operator. She says, where are they? And she's trying to count the houses, because when you just look right straight across, you can't really figure out the number. But eventually, she sort of gets it right. It takes her a little long. And she said it's either the 4th or the 5th house down on the left. Now, she testifies that at or about this time, she saw a fight going on in the yard, and by the time she called at 5:36, the fight was over. But what she had seen, which she relays later in her call, was that she saw 4 men fighting out in the front yard, and a gentleman with a red shirt or an orange shirt, and she may at some points in various times describe it as a jacket or a shirt, but she describes the color as always either red or orange. She saw a gentleman, saw 4 guys fighting, a gentleman with what appeared to her to be a baseball bat out in the front yard, and that it appeared that he was hitting a man with a baseball bat. That was her description of what took place. That was at 5:36. 5:36:36 to be exact. Fight, that part of it had already occurred. The next door neighbor, Diane Townsley, was describing, she didn't see that fight. She had seen the aftermath of that fight where they were yelling at each other out in the yard. At some point in time, Ms. Towsley says that Mr. Ray Greenlaw fires 3 shots in the air. Almost at the same time, on a 911 phone call, which is roughly a minute or so after the call had initiated. And by the way, this phone call lasted 24 minutes and 24 seconds. She hears 3 gunshots. And she sees it. And she knows who shot her. She says, I Diane Towsley thinks that it was the shorter of the brothers. Nicole Robinson sees, and she is the same way, she doesn't know let's try that again. She doesn't know Ray Greenlaw. She knows Wayne, not very well, but she knows that Wayne is the homeowner, and she's seen Ray Greenlaw on the front porch smoking a bit. And she describes him kind of like Ms. Towsley did, as the person with gray hair wearing a red shirt. She sees him fire 3, what she describes as warning shots. 3 shots into the air. She sees the shots,